There's a trail, a long one that cuts through the middle of Michigan, and it's not just a trail. It's the White Pine Trail, a 92-mile stretch of level paved path with trees and quiet towns running from Grand Rapids to Cadillac. These days you'll see cyclists, walkers, and the occasional three-wheeled traveler cruising on it. But this path wasn't always so reflective. A long time ago, back when steam and steel ruled the land, this trail was a lifeline courtesy of the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad. It moved lumber, houses, appliances, lime, tools, equipment, and the kind of people who didn't mind getting their hands dirty. It connected places you wouldn't find on a postcard, towns built on grit and timber, where trains didn't just pass through, they kept the lights on. It built the Grand Hotel on Mackinac Island in much of northern Michigan. Now, that railroad's gone, abandoned and dismantled, but the whisper of time is still here. The trail has taken on a second life, slower, quieter, and more reflective. Riding a trike here isn't about speed, it's about soaking up the landscape, the small towns that remember, the towns that are gone, and the ghosts of the locomotives echoing through the woods. It's a journey, sure, but not just across Michigan. It's a trip through time, where the past isn't just behind you, it's all around you. And we start our journey at Riverside Park. It's a Grand Rapids park that almost wasn't. And out there is the Grand River. Today it's a big, slow-moving river, but before Grand Rapids was settled, it had some rapids. And the only rapids that you can really compare the rapids that we're here to are the rapids at the Sioux, which drop just over 20 feet in 3 miles. Here in Grand Rapids, they used to drop 17 feet in the same distance. So they were indeed at one time pretty big rapids, hence the name Grand Rapids. Now, Riverside Park's not the official start of the White Pine Trail. That's by a landscaping company with no real parking. So this is where we're gonna start our just over 95-mile journey. I'm Chuck. I'm gonna meet Poppins up the trail a little ways. The channel's Restless Viking. Let's go on an adventure. I think this is the start of the White Pine Trail. And one of the first major landmarks along the White Pine Trail in Grand Rapids is a ball field. I believe it's called Lake Michigan Credit Union Stadium, home of the Whitecaps, the Grand Rapids minor league baseball team. So a long time ago, a timber cruiser was hired by some financiers in New York to go find timber and set up operations in the Michigan territory. So he took a ship through the Great Lakes and came to the mouth of the Grand River and followed the Grand River until it came to the Rogue River. And then he followed the Rogue River north until he came to a large stand of cork pines. And that's when he and his brother set up camp and started building a dam. And the year was 1839. Here they would construct a mill and send logs down the Rogue River to the Grand River. At least what they thought. Because the building of the dam didn't go very well. They didn't have a lot of experience. And the next year, as they struggled to build the dam, an engineer named Smith Lapham arrived and he got the project on track. And he went by the name Squire Lapham. And the town of Laphamville was born. But it was short-lived because by 1866, when the town was incorporated, it was called Rockford because of some rocks that created a ford just downriver. And if you're a shopper from the area, you might be familiar with the shopping area called Squire Street Square, named after Squire Lapham. And by the next year, 1867, the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad reached Rockford, Michigan. And in 1883, Frederick Hirth and G.A. Krause purchased a leather shop in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and the Hirth Krause Shoe Factory was born. And in 1901, they purchased land here in Rockford, Michigan to build a shoe factory. And here they opened the Rockford Shoe Company and started making 300 shoes a day. And in 1914, they produced a shoe that was called the 1,000-mile shoe, the Wolverine shoe. And if you've ever heard of the Hush Puppy, you might know where this story's going. In 1921, the company became the Wolverine Shoe and Tanning Corporation. And Wolverine Worldwide made it to the New York Stock Exchange in 1965. And today, Wolverine Worldwide is still headquartered in Rockford, Michigan, but they don't make shoes here anymore. In 1867, the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad made it here to Wicked Creek, and they built a series of trestles that went over Wicked Creek. But those trestles were plagued by fires and floods, and they kept washing out and burning down. So in 1885, the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad hired a farmer, James House, to cut fieldstone to build this culvert. And the Keystone, 1885. And you can visit it between Cedar Springs and Rockford, Michigan. Today, Wicked Creek's called Stegman Creek. Our next town was named because of some springs next to a grove of cedar trees. And in the 1850s, there was a collection of lumber mills, shingle mills, and farms. And by 1887, a second railroad that ran east-west arrived in Cedar Springs. Right here, I believe, where this USGS benchmark is. It was the Toledo, Saginaw, and Muskegon Railway. And on Christmas Day of 1867, the railroad made it this far north to Cedar Springs, Michigan. So the story goes that in 1936 it was the Great Depression and the nation was in the grip of a snowy and cold winter. And in New York, apparently a feature writer from the New York Sun had been looking for old-fashioned red flannel underwear, the kind with a drop trowel in the back. And he wrote a nationwide article about how he could not find red flannel underwear anywhere. He went as far west as Cleveland and didn't find any and declared the red flannel to be extinct. A few days later, here in Cedar Springs, a Nina Babcock and a Grace Hamilton were owners of the local paper, the Cedar Springs Clipper. And they read an editorial. And in that editorial, it read, "Who but a New Yorker would conclude that all the world doesn't because we don't? Wait, don't write off us lumberjacks yet. We've got plenty of red flannels here in Cedar Springs, Michigan." Now they wrote that because Jack Bullock had a dry goods store in Cedar Springs and was well stocked in red flannels for hunters and farmers of the area. And that editorial was apparently picked up by the Associated Press and spread nationwide. And right after, nationwide orders started pouring into Babcock's dry goods store. And then 3 years later, in 1939, the town celebrated its first Red Flannel Festival. And that festival still happens today in the first Saturday of October. It includes a parade and some Keystone cops that will arrest you if you're not wearing red. Now, I grew up 6 miles north of this town, and we used to come to the Red Flannel Festival before I was a teenager, and I was often concerned about going to Cedar Springs because I might get arrested by those Keystone cops. But now, we continue north to a place that's kind of near and dear to my heart. A place that I spent most of my childhood and grew up in, Sand Lake, Michigan. Well, looky who we have here. It's the lovely and charming Poppins. Oh, Poppins.
Hey, we're in the town of Sand Lake where Chuck learned shenanigans and antics.
So I think what we'll do is go see Dad and Sis and talk a little bit about the history that I know of Sand Lake, which is history that's been passed down. One of the things that we want to illustrate about the railroad are these two houses right here. I'm told that these two houses were kit homes made by Sears and Roebuck. At the end of the 1800s, the beginning of the 1900s, you could get a house that was a kit, mail ordered from Sears and Roebuck or Montgomery Ward's. These two houses were built by great Grandma Simpson and were brought up on the Grand Rapids at Indiana Railroad. And then they were delivered by a wagon here around 1910. In fact, at Mackinac Island, there are kit homes built on the island that were brought up by the Grand Rapids at Indiana Railroad. And the Grand Hotel, a lot of the lumber and equipment and things that they needed to build it were brought up on the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad. In fact, the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad was part of the investors that built the Grand Hotel, I believe, because they wanted the Grand Hotel for passenger tourism. So this is Niall, my dad. It's my sister, Sherry. He's the big cheese here in Sand Lake, Michigan. He used to be the mayor for many years. Sorry, president.
The kid from school would take the train up to Ferris, Michigan, at the fish hatchery.
Yeah.
And they tore the fish hatcheries. Then they'd ride the train back to town.
Oh, so that was like a field trip.
Yeah. In fact, your mother went up there on the train ride. Your grandmother used to ride the train to Grand Rapids to do her shopping.
There you have it from the great Arctic adventurer. The original adventurer of the channel is Niall. And then my sis, who always tried to keep me in line.
Yeah.
No, I'm.
But she... So right here, just south of Pearson, which is up there, and north of Sand Lake, on August 15th of 1900, the northbound express was northbound with summer tourists. And southbound number 2 was coming southbound from Mackinac City with overnight passengers. And in dense fog, those two trains collided head on at 60 miles an hour. And it was just before 5 a.m. But yeah, here was, I believe, the worst accident that ever happened on the GR&I Railway. And on June 2nd of 1881, the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad arrived from that direction, from the south, here in Howard City. And Howard City has a claim to fame that involves knives. I believe it was in the 1900s when a Hudson Knife Company was established here in Howard City. And it went through some changes over those years and eventually became what was known as the Olson Knife Company, which was a pretty popular brand of knife back in the day. And if you ever drove up 131, you would have seen signs that were very similar to the Burma Shave signs that you saw on Route 66. And some of those signs would say a slogan that was, "Fatty, fatty, run for your life. Here comes Skinny with an Olson knife." And those appeared on billboards through the 50s and 60s along the north-south highways that came through this area. And Olson Knife Company today is still in business, but manufactured mostly, I believe, in Germany and in other locations. It was known as a high-quality knife. So it was June of 1869 when the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad finished construction of the rail across the Little Muskegon River. And they built a station on the other side. And one of the owners, I believe, named it Morley, I think after the name of someone else. But over there is the Morley Dam, and this is Northland Drive, and way out there is Morley Pond. Morley actually grew quite quickly after it was established as a lumbering town. It had like 70 buildings by like the next year. And the population in 1870 was 323 people. And at the time, it had the largest sawmill along the line, and it was quite a busy place with nothing. And this is what gets me: when you took the train up here, they didn't have forests like this. It was just tree stumps, and they started getting the stumps removed so that they could build farms and things.
On February 21st, 1887, Maud Ferris Luce was born. Now, she was known as the oldest living person in June of 2001. She lived until March. She aged 115 years, 25 days. And she was born right here in Morley, Michigan.
As we get north of Morley, we come to Morley Stanwood High School and a little town that doesn't really exist anymore, but there is some evidence. And I'm thinking this might be evidence of the depot from a place that started as Bell's Crossing, which wasn't a real place really until it got its post office in 1884. And one of those were established at the general store that existed in Borland, Michigan at the time. And the town probably got its name because D. Borland actually owned the general store where the post office was established. And over the years, it was primarily a lumber town and then eventually converted to a farming community. And it survived as a farming community into the early part of the 20th century. In 1905, the post office actually closed. But the general store was operated until 1957 by a Herbert Gleason Mingo, and his nickname was Big Elk. Now, Big Elk was emblazoned on a sign at that general store, and Big Elk was an herbalist. And people would ride the railroad, tourists would ride the railroad to Borland. They would get off, and then they would be regaled by stories from Big Elk, I'm told. And he used to give advice on herbs, what herbs to use, because I guess at one time he was a world traveler, and he had a lot of stories about his travels, and he had a lot of knowledge and information about the herbs that he also sold at the general store. So it was kind of a popular hipster spot through the 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s that they would stop here and chat with the man named Big Elk.
So the highest temperature was reached right here in Stanwood, Michigan. It was in July of 1936. Along with Mayo, Michigan, it reached 112 degrees, and that was without air conditioning.
So that's Stanwood's claim to fame. We're gonna get some lunch here at the Corner Cafe. This former Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad line has been transformed thanks to decades of work by the Michigan DNR, by the Friends of the White Pine Trail, and by a donation from Fred Meyer of the Meyer stores. What began as an abandoned corridor that was kind of forgotten has grown into one of the most accessible, one of the most popular, and rewarding long-distance trails in the state. The DNR took over the line in the 90s, and what was once rusted rails was turned to smooth pavement with the help of local volunteers and the Friends of the White Pine Trail. In the last decade, a lot of the trail towns have all stepped up to create infrastructure, adding rest areas, shelters, facilities. There's lots of places to stay along the trail, from hotels to campgrounds. You can stop for coffee in one town, and then a little further down the trail you can stop for lunch, and then by evening you can end up in the middle of nowhere, in a good way. It's nearly fully paved now, with just two sections that still need work and a few road crossings, but they expect to finish those up early this year. Check out the deer. He just got to the edge and he jumped for no reason. Our next town was settled in 1855 by George and Zara French. Back then it was known as the village of Leonard, but local lumbermen knew it as Big Rapids. We're headed to what once, a couple years ago, was the abandoned rail depot and the old railroad station.
How y'all doing?
Good, how are you?
Good. Is this Chuck and Poppins?
Is this John?
Yes, it is.
Nice to meet you, sir.
Likewise.
Back in 1870, the railroad rolled into Big Rapids and the depot became the town's front porch. Over the years, it fell into disrepair. Lots of talk about fixing it, but not much action. Until now. So it's pretty cool to have a local business that services the trail, and they kept as much of the original depot feel as they could. So it's got a really cool vibe, and it's just literally 10 feet off the trail. Einstein Cycles just opened their third shop inside the old station. The landlord kept the original charm and added new life. The shop is servicing trail riders and planning sponsored rides up the northern half of the White Pine Trail. We met with Trevor, the owner, and Jonathan, the manager. Today was their grand opening, and it seems like they aren't here to just dabble. We also met Paul from the Friends of the White Pine Trail, a walking encyclopedia and one of the volunteers behind the trail's rebirth. He's one of the folks making this whole thing move, sharing news of new places to stay, new spots to eat, and efforts to preserve the past while paving the future. This isn't just a trail anymore, it's turning into something bigger, a destination with stories, sweat, and momentum. It's becoming more than a trail, it's becoming an adventure. And we also had the honor of meeting Alan and Sharon, who reminded us what an adventure the railroad had been.
The fish hatchery used to put that pond full of fish up about this long. And then they had a railroad car that they had at the fish hatchery. They would fill cans full of trout, milk cans full
painted
of
red.
And the Wolverine car. And the train would stop. They would pick that car up, and where it went across the stream somewhere, they would stop and they would dump.
Is that right?
That's how they put them trout.
That's how they...
Since these are like a lawn chair, it makes sense to have a picnic lunch.
See ya!
See ya, y'all. Enjoy the ride.
Thanks! Well, Poppins, that was a cool visit with a white pine dude and all the work that they're doing on the trail.
They're so creative, I love it.
So here in Big Rapids in 1884, a man named Woodbridge Ferris started the Big Rapids Industrial School. And their goal was to give their students a marketable skill in today's modern society of 1884. And that school became a public college in 1950. And today that public college is Ferris State University with an enrollment of over 10,000 students.
We're here in Paris, Michigan, and no, it wasn't named for Paris, France. It was named for John Parrish, who settled here in 1865. Now, 14 years later, the town sadly burnt, and when they rebuilt it, the townspeople decided to name it Paris instead of Parish, just dropping the H. This fish hatchery opened in 1881.
And it was a vital hub for rearing salmon and trout. The hatchery thrived thanks to the location near the Muskegon River and the old rail line. It closed in the 60s, but Mecosta County brought it back to life in 1976 as a public park. Through its history, generations have come here. My mom rode the train on a field trip.
As a youngster, we would stop here every time we were heading up north, and we would feed the fish. It was a blast. And then fast forward, we brought our children here to feed the fish, and memories were made.
This hatchery is that kind of place that sticks with you. But today, it's at risk. The walls are crumbling, the ponds are failing, and the fence around most of the ponds, that's not just for safety. It's a quiet warning that this place may not last much longer without help. So Poppins and I are putting our money where our memories are and donating $1,000 of our YouTube revenue to help restore the hatchery. Save the Ponds has a goal of $150,000. They've raised $104,000 so far. If you can, hit the donation link in the description. Be a part of the Restless Viking crew that is helping to save Great Lakes landmarks. Let them know in your donation that you saw it here. Any amount will do. They need it and they'll remember it.
In the 1930s, this area was turned into a WPA work camp. They put men to work during the Great Depression. They helped build infrastructure and plant trees. These men lived right on site. Fast forward to the 1980s, and a group of teenagers, high schoolers, came to this area, and in a shed they found the metal cots left over from the WPA camp. Now, they decided to build something spectacular to represent Paris, Michigan. And what did they decide? Well, an Eiffel Tower, of course. Sharon told us, a lifelong resident here, that they light up the Eiffel Tower at Christmas time, and it's just beautiful.
Bed parts. So we were told that we had to go by this. Richard James has spent some money to create a western town. I don't think there's enough room in this town for both of us, Poppins.
We're here in Reed City, known as the Great American Crossroads. Two railroads intersected right here, and they even celebrate with a festival every August. The Pure Marquette ran east and west, and then the Grand Rapids, Indiana Railroad ran north and south.
Is that what you call a conjunction junction?
Reed City is the home of the old rugged cross. It was put here to commemorate Reverend George Bernard and his wife Hannah, who spent their final years here in Reed City. Reverend George Bernard wrote the hymn, The Old Rugged Cross, in 1912 at Albion College. Then he and his wife continued their ministry for 40 years and then settled here in Reed City for their final days.
Here in Reed City, you have the crossroads, obviously the Pure Marquette and the White Pine Trail. And that crossroads, if you go that way, you're going to run into Lake Huron, I think, right? Or you're going to get close to it. Of course, you go north and then you can go west. But you have a beautiful depot here that's now a kind of a community center. So the White Pine Trail was built by logging in the beginning. Timber was in great supply, and the way to get it out of the North Woods was to cut it down and to cut it up and then to put it on a train and send it south to build houses and build America. And when timber wasn't plentiful anymore, the towns along the railroad started to die, and we found more than a dozen towns along the White Pine Trail that grew because of the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad. But over the years, starting at the turn of the 1900s, they started to decline and then eventually disappear, including this site right here at the end of Orano Road.
This settlement was first called McDonald's Switch. Then it was renamed Orano. Then it was moved a mile north to where the switch actually was in the rail line. They moved a mile here, and then Northland Drive was built, and they moved a mile east.
So Orano stayed alive because it relocated to Northland Drive, or Old US 131, and that allowed it to capture the traffic of everyone heading north on the road. When they built the freeway, that took away traffic from 131, and Orano slowly fell into decline, and that's the old schoolhouse.
So the last memory that we could find was of Bonnie Truax, a resident. She said she remembered buying penny candy at the general store and then going to the school across the street.
The story of just one of the many ghost towns along the White Pine Trail. Our next town is called the End of 20 because the tracks ended 20 miles north of the Ferris terminal. And then a store and a few other operations popped up, some houses. And then the tracks eventually continued on, and then it was time to incorporate the town and to name it. So if you were a settler in the area, you could buy land for $1.25 from a land grant agent whose last name was Leroy. So the town, when they incorporated, decided to call themselves, after that land grant agent, Leroy. And that's kind of an important thing to know about the history of Michigan. If you wanted to settle somewhere, you'd have to find a land grant agent who would sell you land. And that's how much of the land in northern Michigan was settled. We just went through the tunnel that goes under M115, and now we approach Cadillac as we pass mile 90. And Cadillac owes much of his existence to the timber industry. It was once known as Clam Lake, and the city sits on a canal known as the Clam Lake Canal that was hand dug in 1873. And it connected Lake Mitchell to Lake Cadillac. And it still exists today at Lake Mitchell State Park. And that canal helped sawmill owners float their logs from one lake to the other, fueling that timber boom. When the Grand Rapids and Indiana Railroad came in 1872, and that helped establish Cadillac as a key to transportation in the lumber industry. Just when we arrived in Cadillac, we got a flat tire, but we were close enough to Grumpy just to go grab it and to grab the bike. So Cadillac. So we're not sure if this is actually the official end of the trail. I guess it is. The city of Cadillac just put this in. Kind of a really cool trailhead marker or shelter, but the trail actually ends down there about a quarter to a half a mile, and the sign down there on the sidewalk says no bikes. So there are some helpful billboards when you finish your trip on, you can find some area lodging with a QR code, explore the downtown, a little map of the trails. So some of you are familiar with Ephraim Shea, who invented the Shea locomotive, which was a geared locomotive that could handle steep grades and it could handle rickety lumber tracks. This Shea locomotive was built in 1889. It was last used by the Sioux Lumber Company, and it was restored in 1985. And Cadillac had its brush with the Shea locomotive when the Michigan Iron Works of Cadillac built some Shea locomotives. And because of the lumber industry and the use of the Shea locomotive, Cadillac attracted a lot of immigrants, especially Swedes. And all that lumbering business activity paved the way for Cadillac to develop an industry base and to become the second largest city in northern Michigan. Cadillac isn't known for just timber and trains, though. There is one story from Cadillac in 1882 when it became the county seat. It was in a battle with Manton, and there was a bit of an armed conflict that involved a brass band and a bunch of people that I think were drinking when they went to Manton and stole the county records after a vote in the county to make Cadillac the county seat. And you can check our video out about the entire story.
Over the years, Cadillac has reinvented itself with tourism, due in part to the Civilian Conservation Corps, who built Cabernet ski area during the Depression.
Oh, and in 1975, Kiss the Rock Band performed a concert here at the high school because the local high school team used the motto, "Keep it simple, stupid," as both a game plan and a pep anthem. And Cadillac has a vibrant music scene with places like The Venue or Coyote Crossing and organizations like Gopherwood Music. And in the summer, there's celebrations like Cadillac's Festival of the Arts, the greatest fourth in the North, and the Craft Beer Festival. If you get a chance this summer, you should make a trip to Cadillac and experience all it has to offer. The White Pine Trail is more than just a scenic trail. It's a living museum that stretches 92 miles from Grand Rapids to Cadillac, Michigan. The former Grand Rapids and Indiana Rail Corridor has exchanged the roar of locomotives for the whir of bicycles. Once a vital artery transporting logs and timber and shoes, and even the material to build the Grand Hotel. It eventually evolved into the fishing line, which moved tourists to the north. And now it carries travelers through towns that were built by grit, lumber, steel, rail, and even tourism. They reflect on Michigan's working class and its quirky resilience.
As the journey rolls north, ghost towns like Orano fade into the distance, while places like Reed City hold tight to their heritage.
The White Pine Trail isn't just a trike or a bike trip. It's a slow ride through Michigan's soul. I'm Chuck.
I'm Poppins.
The channel's Restless Viking. Thanks for coming along on the adventure, and we'll see you soon.